In the fields of Farinham, a small village in England, there, or at least once, stood a scarecrow. No one knows who made it or where it came from. Locals in the surrounding area claimed it was put there for a purpose, but for what purpose has now been forgotten. I've known about the scarecrow since I could remember. Whenever my parents took me down the countryside to visit grandfather, one of the many farmers who occupied Farinham, whenever I ventured out to play, I was always told never to go near the scarecrow. I was curious why. It was in one of grandfather's fields, so I couldn't get into trouble with one of the neighbours, and it was near the farmhouse, so I couldn't lose my way back. But every time I went out the house, I was still told not to go near it. One night, I asked my grandfather why I wasn't allowed near it, and he told me a story about his school years. He once attended the all-boys school that has since been closed down due to unknown circumstances. My parents believed it lost funding after the war, but my grandfather knew the truth. He told me, in his story, that the village was once under attack by a group of mad people who wanted, out of all things, the school's history teacher. As he was telling this story, he showed me his old class photo showing him standing tall with his fellow classmates. He also told me what became of them, except for one, a black-haired boy named Jeremy Baines. Grandfather explained that that was one of the attackers who disappeared after that night. I was captivated by this tale, until we got to the army of scarecrows, which made me never want to look at the scarecrow again. As I got older, I believed he told me that part to stop me from going near the thing. As the years went by, my grandfather became too frail to look after the farm, and asked me if I wanted to inherit it. After a long conversation with my parents, mostly about how a farm from the 1960s could provide a stable income, I decided to follow my grandfather's wishes and started my first week running my childhood farm. The first couple of days were difficult, but I eventually got used to the farm routines. I always looked back at that field with that lone scarecrow watching over me, almost like it wanted me to go near it. It was almost hypnotising me towards it, but I would always break control, until one fateful day. In the early hours of a normal Sunday morning, I heard a knock on my door and met one of the neighbouring farmers. He explained to me that his crops were getting eaten by crows and he didn't have the material to make his own scarecrow. After looking around the farmhouse and the barn, I soon realised that the only scarecrow he could use was the one in the field. I thought about it. For some reason my intuition was telling me something was wrong about it, but that was probably caused by my parents' warnings. After fighting my fear, I went out to the field to finally meet the lone scarecrow, face to face. Despite knowing it was nothing more than an old sack and clothes filled with straw, I couldn't help but feel excited at the thought of seeing the scarecrow up close. It was like lining up to meet Father Christmas. As I got near the figure, I noticed it had a frightening appearance that could scare more than just crows. And again, my intuition was still telling me something was wrong about it. But I pushed that aside when I reached it. I stood in front of it for a good long minute, feeling slightly anticlimactic, but I shouldn't have expected much. It was only a scarecrow after all. I went to untie at the feet when I suddenly felt something unusual. I was expecting it to feel light, but the scarecrow felt more heavy than expected. Curious, I took out a knife and made a small cut in the trousers, and saw a small piece of skin inside the scarecrow. I dropped the knife in horror. This whole time a body was in this thing, and no one did anything about it. Without a second thought, I put my hands on the head sack and slowly pulled it off, and saw the face of a young, black-haired boy staring at me. I thought he was dead at first, but he looked alive, but unmoving, like he was frozen. As I stared at him, I felt like I knew this boy from somewhere, until I remembered grandfather's story and the class photo he showed me. This was Jeremy Baines, the mad student who went missing. I continued to stare into his eyes. It couldn't have been him, could it? I thought. He looks exactly the same as the photo, like he hasn't aged at all. I wanted to run back to the farm, but for some reason I couldn't. I felt stuck in place, until a green mist clouded my vision. Once the mist cleared, my hearing vanished, and I could see the face slowly decomposed right in front of me, until there was nothing but a skeleton, and then dust. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move my body at all. It was like I was trapped, only seeing everything, but couldn't interact with anything. But my body was moving, but it wasn't me in control. I don't know how, but I knew somehow the Scarecrow had possession of me, and I could do nothing but watch. I could feel him get used to my body, like he was testing it out. I felt my mouth move, but I couldn't hear anything. But I knew he used my voice to say, "This will do," and walked off. Sniffing the air like he had a bad cold, he got used to my legs quickly and continued to march on across the field and away from the farm. He walked around the village, constantly sniffing in the air like he was looking for something or someone, until we both arrived at a small cottage. I instantly knew whose cottage this was. It belonged to that author who lived here. I used to play with her and the other children when I was down here, and now she was in danger. But there was nothing I could do to warn her. The Scarecrow walked up to the door and knocked. Slowly the door opened, and out came the author. She was young, with long blonde hair and blue eyes. I could see her mouth move, saying my name and asking how I've been. But all I could feel was the Scarecrow saying, "You look just like your grandmother." She gave a confused look and replied with a few words, until the Scarecrow eventually said, "He'll come to save you. I know he will." Looking worried, she tried to shut the door, but I could feel him use my hands to break it down. He grabbed hold of her, saying, "You will bring him to me. He will pay for what he did to me and my family." The very thought of more than one of these things was horrifying, but I could see the mouth of the woman say, "It's one of you, isn't it? One of those monsters my great-grandmother warned me about." I could feel my mouth repeat what the Scarecrow said before, "and he will pay for what he did to my family." I was wondering who this he was, until I felt my head turn over the now knocked-down door, and saw a grey-haired man in a black velvet clothes look directly at me with eyes that burned with fire. The Scarecrow sniffed at him and said, "You're him, aren't you?" I could see the stranger say, "I gave you a chance all those years ago, and you didn't listen, so I punished you. I clearly didn't punish you enough." He pulled out a small object from his pocket and aimed it at me. A small flash appeared, and I was suddenly on the floor, completely still. But this time, it was the Scarecrow that was frozen. All I could remember next was my body slowly being dragged out across the floor, seeing the sky, the ground, until finally deep in the woods that surrounded the village. We were eventually placed in a small cave, where no one could ever find us, by the stranger, who once again looked me straight in the eyes, but this time with a more sorrow expression. "I'm sorry this happened to you. If I could, I would help you, but there's nothing I can do," he said as he walked out of the cave. I knew he wasn't talking to the monster who had stolen my body. He was talking directly at me. The last thing I knew was him walking back into the cave, this time with a small cloth in his hands, and placing it over my head. And then, nothing.